was describing, how did we do that? We did that first by establishing a navy. But in these regions, the Pacific Rim, the Caribbean, particularly in the Canal Zone, what you see is the United States effectively becoming a realist power. You know, wrapped up in all kinds of racial rhetoric, and sort of this masculinity. And again, remember what's going on in the United States. We're becoming a modern society. Men in the 1900s, or the 1800s I should say, went out and killed bears and chopped down trees and provided for their family and all that kind of stuff. Men in the 20th century are in offices, are arguing cases before judges, are salespeople, etc. There's a crisis in terms of classical masculinity that is pressing against the American public at the same time. And Roosevelt is largely going to portray that. Be done with your childish days, take up the man's burden of being in charge here. And by 1900, going into the 20th century, what you see is that the United States, from a naval standpoint, has been able to expand its influence throughout the globe, particularly in the Pacific Rim. That is our goal. Right? When we come back to China, China has a 2,000-year history. They had the unfortunate timing of being in the midst of the Civil War once these European powers started to fall off. Right? China is going to reemerge, and a 2,000-year history, you would suspect that. But the idea here is to find ways in which to gain access to that Pacific Rim market, which includes Indonesia, which includes Indochina, which includes Korea, which includes Japan. Right? And keep in mind just the vastness of what we're talking about here. Here's itsy-bitty little Texas, right? When we get to the Pacific theater of the World War II, it's all on us, right? That ain't gonna be the case in the European theater. But this is, how do you conquer that kind of space, right? And how does Japan, for example, attack Hawaii with 3 battle groups and not be seen, right? I mean, totally in concert, right? So in essence, what I was trying to do is, the Philippines is an example of that. Is to say, in essence, is that our American foreign policy is not a policy that is connected to democracy, is not connected to the values that the American public have. The Philippine War, again, I wasn't taught this when I was young. You probably weren't in grade school. I guarantee you Filipinos are, right? That the Americans came here and basically occupied us. It is very close to the situation that we're going to see in 2003 Iraq, right? Of us seeing one thing and the locals seeing something very different. And for the most part, what you see is that this is going to be followed through in terms of American foreign policy. We are playing a realist school. So don't worry about the specifics so much of these. Again, if we had more time, progressive Europe foreign policy. I want to spend more time on World War II because of its significance to modern America. But these certainly are kind of pointing that way. The policy is often termed as this, again, leave it to an academic to create some non-colonial imperial expansion. We are not putting down flags and saying we are the colonial mother country, as Europeans are. But we are not giving these places, Philippines, Cuba, Central American neighbors, any options in terms of their own national sovereignty. Cuba cannot make policies that we find to be distasteful to the United States, or we will overturn them. And that's not being independent. You guys are in a stage of life where you're in this process of becoming more independent. Mom and dad can still say, no, I'm not going to do that, and you are beholden to it, you still are not independent. It's that transition. Again, it's awkward to use stage of life when we're talking about adult countries here, but nonetheless. You'll often see in the textbook dollar diplomacy or Yankee imperialism. We're not setting down a flag, we're not wearing red coats and marching into these areas, but we are as much in control as the British ever were over the American colonies. Okay? We just don't see it domestically. All right, which leaves us sort of on the verge of discussing the World War I, right? Referred to at the time as the Great War for reasons, again, it's like Great Depression, it's not a good thing. And where does this come from is a subject which would take several weeks to talk about in a European history class. And again, while I prefaced last time, this is a class in U.S. history. World War I is not that consequential to the United States. We enter the war less than a year before it ends. And oh, by the way, in 9 months, we lose more fighting men in that battle in World War I than in all of Vietnam. That gives you a sense of the severity of it. But if you're looking at what causes the First World War, what you've got is this laundry list of issues. And I'll just touch on a few of this. Queen Victoria, by the way. So she's been in charge. And most of her children are sitting on the thrones of most of the major European powers. So when I talk about personal rivalries here, it's largely cousins who are vying against cousins. The King of Germany is the cousin to the King of England. And you may love your cousins, but some people don't. And it's very much a rivalry of personal petty, who has the biggest yacht, who has the biggest fortress, who has the biggest bomber, right? Who has the biggest battleship in this case. The alliance system that existed since Napoleon's time, 1815, basically was structured to do what? To prevent a single country from being strong enough to do what Napoleon did, was invade everyone and basically force the European powers to cooperate. This alliance system is going to be in place through a set of largely secret treaties, and that's going to be problematic. The Europeans were okay with that. Are you allied with so-and-so? Well, we're not sure. It's pretty clear as we get to the maps that if you want to kind of look and see who is the central alliance, who are the allies in this war, France and Russia on one side, Germany and Austria on the other. And we will see that kind of play out in a short bit of time. Most of the brinksmanship, and it's just a fancy word for kind of going right up to the edge of war, right? What are you going to do right up to the edge of war? Is being conducted in the colonial possessions. So the wars are taking place, the conflict is taking place in Morocco, in South Africa, in the Middle East, Palestine, in China, and elsewhere. What you see is, in essence, by the time we get to World War I, this starts to come home. You're not going to get any sympathy from me for kings and queens who have colonies that suddenly their policies are going to start coming home to roost. When we get to World War I, it is going to be conveniently called World War I. It could just as easily be called the Third Serbian War. The war in Serbia meant war, and it's a colonial battle between Russia and Austria-Hungary. Okay. What do you need to know here for 1302? Not that. You don't need to know the intricacies of it. But recognize is that these nation states are vying constantly and going just up to global war and then pulling back away. At a certain point in time, if you're playing chicken on the highway, you're going to lose. Right? At a certain point in time, you're not going to be able to pull the car back to the front. Personal rivalries, as I mentioned, these tend to go together in terms of the Civil War and military planning. Is that by the 20th century, your military capabilities are much more mobile and much more deadly. And as a result, particularly a country like Germany, as I mentioned last time, Germany's a relatively recent country. They're emerging as a regional superpower. And they have rivals on either side, Russia to the east, France to the west. 3 wars with France in a span of about 20 years. They're looking and saying, we cannot win a war where we're fighting on 2 fronts. One of their lead generals, von Schlieffen, right, so the von Schlieffen plan is often referenced here, has a plan that says the only way in which Germany can win a larger war is if we know in advance we're about to declare war, we take all of our troops, or most of the major force of the troops from the Eastern Front. Russia, you're not going to beat. Russia's too big, right? But we can knock out France. And so, King, if you tell me we're about to go to war, let me know in advance, and I will start putting troops on trains. I will start bringing heavy artillery to the Western Front, and we will smack France hard, knock them out of the war, and then we can take our time in dealing with Russia. Okay? That plan, I was talking to another student earlier this morning, those military plans tend to take them out of life of their own. Right? So if you suddenly have, I need to know, tell me when to do this. You're texting me, I'm texting. Right? You're sending, whatever, telegrams back and forth. Are we ready to go? Are we ready to go? At a certain point in time, there's a pressure to act. There's a pressure to say, yeah, go for it. And we're going to see that in the example in terms of Germany. But the notion of the kind of militaristic capability has exceeded the war planning strategies of these older generals. They're still thinking of cavalry charges into machine gun fire. They're still thinking of staging, set battle formations with poison gas, being able to mow people down. Aircraft for reconnaissance. Mostly the aircraft in World War I, while there is some, dogfights and whatnot, it's mostly reconnaissance. It's not as intricate as we're going to see. It's the key to World War II. Obviously you can see mechanized artillery, or mechanized infantry, I should say. And these things, the Unterboten, the U-boat, right? Recognize how small they are, right? So this thing could fit kind of in an angle inside this classroom. A torpedo is about as long as your arm, right? So it can punch a hole into a boat, but it really can't blow it up. It's not like kind of contemporary submarines, nonetheless. So all of this is kind of percolating along. What happens? Europe is in complete peace, right? Everybody's getting along in the summer. This, again, makes you nervous when you see what's going on currently in Ukraine. In June of 1914, who are the combatants here? Germany, a rising superpower, is tied to Austria-Hungary, a collapsing old power, right? So you've got, in essence, this sort of this alliance of sort of cultural regional stuff. As I mentioned before, France and Russia are allied closely. England is sort of the odd one out. England is sort of a freelancer. They're not going to say whether they're allied one way or the other, which is going to cause all kinds of problems. Austria-Hungary wants to maintain control over this region, and particularly over Serbia. You can see Montenegro, Albania, Bulgaria, etc., all in this region. The Serbians are seeking their independence, and they're reaching out to Russia to do that. Right? Again, all of this is interesting, whatever, but it is not necessarily relevant to a U.S. history class. The king of Austria-Hungary, I think at this point in time, is 97 years old. And his son and heir apparent, Franz Ferdinand, is going to go to Serbia as a representative of this location. There's going to be an assassination of the heir apparent. And Austria-Hungary, who is not as strong as anyone, recognizes the Serbians are being backed by the Russians. The Austrian-Hungarians ask the Germans, you have our back if we start pressuring the Serbians? Because they're going to reach out to the Russians, right? This instigates a series of secret treaties, secret agreements. And you can see, Germany agrees, yes, we will back you if you invade, and Russia responds. Russia reaches out and says to France, if you're going to invade down here, and they go after Russian troops, will you attack Germany in response, right? Von Schlieffen, the German argument is like, we can't have a two-front war. We've got to wipe out France. Well, the only way to get to France is through these unaligned neutral countries, the Netherlands and Belgium in particular. And guess what? Here you have England, arguably one of the major superpowers of the region, not telling anyone, no one knows, that there's a secret treaty with Belgium that if they are invaded, they will declare war on the invaders, right? Why do I go through this? Not only is how quickly you go from European countries at complete peace to European countries in total war, right? 6 weeks time. That's as long as we've been in this class. It's shorter than we've been in this class. You go from, hey, everything's great to World War I, right? But how does this war start? When we get to the end of this question, one of the things the United States is going to agree on is that it's Germany's fault. Right? One of the things that historians have always been dealing with here is, who gets blamed for all this? Who is to blame? The whole system's to blame. The whole idea of how you work with diplomats and kings and queens and nephews and cousins and yada yada and von Schlieffen plans, it's idiotic. It's rooted in an 18th century thinking process. Right? When this happens, in essence, when the war is declared, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia, Serbia reaches out to Russia, Russia reaches out to France, they declare war on Austria, right? Germany declares war on those two, and to avoid a two-front war, Germany immediately sends all of its troops into France trying to knock them out, meaning what? Great Britain is drawn in by treaty to say, we are now at war, right? 6 weeks time, boom. Guess what? Everybody's at war. When you look at World War II, World War II, we get to World War II, we'll spend almost 2 weeks on that conflict. And the reason is because it's complicated. It's taking place literally around the globe. For the most part, World War I does not follow those rules. And as a result, I've got 4 little images here, which will basically tell you, in essence, how World War I is going to unfold. Again, understand the combatants. For some reason, France isn't on here. France, Great Britain, Russia. We'll get back to Italy. Italy's on their side or our side? Our side becomes the English-French. It's a trick question. They start on the German side, and they switch sides in the middle. Germany, Japan is the same way. Japan fights on the American side. Right? They're our ally in World War I. The central powers are largely Germany and its client states. We'll leave the Middle East out of it for right now. By contrast, you know, you're gonna see later on a different orientation of countries involved in World War II. But this is largely the map in terms of hostilities. Germany tries its all-out push, and in essence, recognizes that it can withstand Russian troops for a period of time. This is largely going to be accomplished in the first 6 to 8 weeks of this campaign. What happens is when you get to 1915, these battle lines get drawn very firmly, particularly in the Western Front, right? So if you ever travel there, you can see these bunkers and trench warfare. A lot of the trenches have rooms very much like this, with electric lighting and ventilation. These are not, the reason is because the lines don't move all that much, right? And what are they doing? Their generals are basically amassing troops, basically blowing a whistle and saying, go get them, boys. And unless they're Wonder Woman, they're going to run right into, you know, machine gun fire, artillery fire, et cetera, et cetera. It is a bloodbath. And it does not change much, right? It does not change in terms of, the Russian front is going to be more fluid because of the territory is a little less conducive to kind of having trench warfare. And that's going to be again true in World War II. But for the most part, from 1915 to for 2 years, what you've got is a meat grinder, right? Of just new ways to kill human beings. In many regards, the one saving grace to this, it doesn't help for the servicemen who are involved in it, is that it is not aimed at civilians. We have to get to World War II before we start talking about civilian deaths, right? That's not true for the occupied regions of Belgium and what have you, right? So there are some occupied territories. By the time we get to 1917, what has happened? Russia has gone into revolution. Its society is unwilling to continue to produce this. And there's a counter-revolution following that first revolution that is going to put in the Soviet Union. It's going to create the world's first socialist state. You're going to have unrest in Germany. You're going to have talks of overthrowing the Tsar, just like the Tsar, the king, the Kaiser. Just like today in Russia, you see people who are opposed to the war internally in Russia, who are opposed to it. These countries are all cracking. And what they're trying to avoid is the entry of the United States into this battle. The United States is sitting on the sidelines this entire time. And we are not involved in any way, shape, or form. We're not supplying weapons, we're not supplying manpower. We don't see it as our fight. We see it as a fight of kings and queens and colonies. And you know, they're going to fight over this and they're going to fight over this. By the time we get to 1917, 1918, Germany is about to crack. They are not going to last much longer. And you know, you could argue that France and England are pretty damn close to that same situation. They basically said, you're down in the fourth quarter, I hate to use a football analogy, right? You're down in the fourth quarter by 2 touchdowns. Tony Romo was back to me, dating myself. What are you going to do? You're going to go deep. You're going to throw a Hail Mary pass. You're going to do what you can do to possibly win. And the big push, which is the argument that they make, is to, in essence, throw everything they got to try and knock France out at the end. And one of the fears that they have is that the Americans will resupply this army. And so in 1917, the Germans say to the United States, we've avoided sinking your ships, we have avoided sinking or attacking you. We will now treat any ship, even US ships, as combatants in this region. We will start killing Americans in Europe if they get in our way. Right? And as we're going to see, that is going to precipitate the United States to finally get into this war. Not that I'm advocating that they should have or something like that. When the United States comes in, it's, you know, fourth quarter and everyone's exhausted. It's like having a whole new team show up who is well rested, certainly well equipped, has all the money and wealth and capability that these other countries lack. Had the United States come in on Germany's side, they probably would have tipped the balance in favor of Germany. We don't. We come in on the side of the British and the English, or the British and the French, and the Russians, right? And it tips the balance. And as I said, 9 months is the extent to which we are involved in World War I. The consequences of this are significant, but the actual fighting in World War I, the domestic front is a hell of a lot more important, again, for this. No one has seen anything like this war, right? They got a taste of it if you look at the Civil War, but then you're talking about Americans against Americans, right? And in large part with technologies that had still been pretty rudimentary. They were still using cartridges. They weren't using repeating rifles, et cetera, et cetera. The Civil War casualties, or fatalities, I should say, are massive, the greatest in American history. 600,000 military dead as a result of battle. This is a drop in the literal bucket of what takes place in World War I. No one has seen levels of carnage like this, right? And traditional notions of military bravery, of standing up and charging, are suicide, right? The idea of getting up every morning and waiting to see whether or not your colonel is going to send you back into artillery fire, poison gas, razor wire, repeating rifles, machine guns fire, et cetera, is psychologically damaging to these folks. They don't get post-traumatic stress disorder yet. They don't get the idea that you can't push a human being past certain levels. Battle of the Somme, 60,000 dead on the first day of engagement, 1.2 million over the 4 months that it takes place. Right? These kinds of levels of carnage are things that the United States is looking and saying, we got no reason to be sending our men over there.
Where is Somme?
It's in France. Most of this fighting is taking place in France, right? And we'll get back to that when we get to World War II. When the armistice is signed, German troops are not fighting street to street in Berlin. They're sitting in bunkers in France and Belgium and the Netherlands, right? And it's going to have an effect in terms of the military response to this. The U.S. entry into this war, as I mentioned, is a last gasp effort on the part of Germany. We are culturally biased towards the English. Our trade and our kind of financial ties are to England and France, a hell of a lot more than they are to Germany. And so there's a lot of scholarship, if you're interested in that, in terms of the bias the United States brings into this. Germany plans this big offensive, and what really tips it is U-boats, is submarine attacks on American shipping. The Lusitania passenger ship is sunk in 1915. It kind of prepares the United States to be looking for this stuff. The Lusitania is about the size of the Titanic, and the Lusitania is hit by 2 of these kind of arm-length torpedoes, sinks in 15 minutes. How long does the Titanic take? A couple hours. Well, Leo's got to get out of the handcuffs first, and then he realizes he's got the diamond or whatever. The movie itself is the movie. Yeah, it takes almost 2 hours for that Titanic to sink after hitting an iceberg the size of this building. The Lusitania goes down in 15 minutes. Why? Because something inside went boom, and they were American munitions being sent to World War I. Right? So we weren't a neutral part. But what you see is, in essence, the United States saying that the Germans cannot simply sink our ships indiscriminately. We give them an ultimatum. The German ambassador to the state of Mexico, which enters revolution in 1911, right? So Mexico is in turmoil as well, is going to say the Zimmerman telegram, and here it is, it's intercepted by the British and immediately given to the Americans. It's going to say to the Mexicans, you've had these long-standing grievances with the United States of America. If we do something that causes the United States to declare war on us, what we're asking you to do is to declare war on the United States, to invade Texas, to invade Arizona, to invade California. And at the end of this war, we will make sure that you get back all of the territories that you have lost, including all those regions, to the United States historically. Mexican government, Carranza government, corrupt, whatever, there's the whole narrative of the Mexican post-revolutionary government. They're not stupid. They're like, thanks for the offer, but no, we've already seen how our neighbors to the north react to any kind of belligerent activity on the part of the regional powers here. But once this is made known, once you've got a reason for war, and the press picks this up, Wilson uses the Zimmerman telegram to demand a declaration of war, which the United States does in April 1917, right? By November of 1918, our first troops are not there until basically the summer, or the spring of 1918. By November of 1918, the war's over, right? So we are not a big, we're a critical late substitution, right? In comes the American military, but we are not there for the span of this war. The Americans had traditionally seen themselves as the harbingers of peace, right? What Woodrow Wilson, national progressive president of the United States, argues is that the United States can have too much honor to fight in this war, but that they see the war as making the world safe for democracy, a new world order. All of these kinds of terms that are turned into QAnon bullshit, right? It's like, they all come from World War I, right? When the internet was invented. No, it wasn't. Don't write that down, that you see in essence this progressive vision. Why have we talked about progressivism? Because it's going to infect or going to begin to kind of define our foreign policy as well. Wilson makes the mistake of going to Europe in the negotiations. So all the various countries, they agree to stop fighting. There is no unconditional surrender. There is no street-to-street fighting in Berlin or in Prague or anything like that. They agreed to stop shooting each other. We've gotten nowhere. Now we're going to negotiate what this war means. How are we going to find a safety? Wilson makes the mistake. He could have just sat back as the kind of American superpower and said, listen, here's what we demand. We're involved in this war. We ain't taking anything else. Right? This is what we demand. Wilson arrives with famously 14 points. And all of them have this kind of progressive stamp to them. All that stuff about progressivism, right? No more secret treaties. No more, let's make sure everybody knows who's allied to everyone else. Free trade, which has always been an American kind of concept of saying, don't make colonies, don't take over, Japan or India or South Africa or something like that, and cut us off from trade. And the reason is we're confident, progressivism, confidence. We're confident in our country making the best products, making the most efficient economic opportunities available for people. We think we're better at it than you are. Stop having these little areas that we can't trade with. Right? That's what we oppose. And again, it doesn't register in American politics, but that's what changes in 2016, and that is a shock. That says something to the rest of the world. We may not be reading it. It doesn't mean it's like science. You may not believe in global warming, but you don't have to believe in it for it to take place. Right? I don't believe that raising treaty or raising tariffs changes our position around the world. It does, right? And it benefits people who are not our allies. They want to isolate the Soviet Union, and Russia's goal is largely to disrupt that unity. It starts in 1918 and it continues to 2022. The idea of Russia is that we want to see Americans arguing with Americans. We want to see NATO dissolved. We want to see the West disorganized, because that gives us a strategic advantage. Wilson proposes effectively United Nations, League of Nations, however you want to call it, and a series of alliances which kind of fall apart as soon as they're written. Right? Wilson comes in and says this is how the New World Order should look. And the Europeans, and particularly the French have lost 25% of their young male population. That means if we were post-World War I French, everyone in this room would have lost a loved one. Every one of us. Right? And we would be very much like the United States post-Civil War. Why? What was it about? And the French and the English are going to say, somebody's going to pay for this. The horror that just was exposed, the people who are now, their mental health is destroyed as a result of this war. I sent my son to war, he came back shell-shocked. Someone's going to pay. The only one who could pay, and certainly the one that they have had tendencies to have conflict with in the past, was Germany. Austria-Hungary had nothing to pay, right? Turkey, not Turkey yet, but the Ottoman Empire had nothing. Germany, at least, as an economic superpower, could pay. And what Wilson agrees to is to say, sure, they did it. They started this war, they're responsible. The Germans are going to agree to this, right? And we get back to the origins of World War II, the stab in the back. You're someone like Adolf Hitler, who is yet to be radicalized, and you are fighting in World War I, and you feel yourself winning, and you are not in a position, you're not fighting street to street in Vienna, he was Austrian, right? And all of a sudden your leaders say, we lost and it was our fault. Your response to that is not going to be sympathetic. It's going to create problems that later on are going to begin to ripple. Germany is going to be occupied, as we're going to talk about. The French troops are going to occupy their industrial heartland, right? So it's like after a war, suddenly Russia comes in and is occupying the Great Lakes region until we pay off our debts, right? The Germans are not allowed to build armaments, they're not allowed to have military upgrades, right? They're treated as if they are in occupied territory. That is not the way in which to kind of end this kind of stuff. America basically turns away from this role almost immediately. The Senate refuses to ratify its membership in the League of Nations, although the United States does attend. They are an attending member, they aren't a voting member. But for the most part, the American public kind of goes back and says, we don't want anything to do with these people. We don't want anything to do with the rest of the world. right? I like Corpus Christi, I like London Mission, I like whatever, hanging out in my church. I don't care about the rest of the world. Well, guess what? You're living in a country and your economic livelihood is determined by the success of a country that is global in reach. You don't have an option. You don't have a choice. That's what the United States is. Right? And again, a snowflake view, oh, we'll just pull up and we'll come home and we'll leave, is okay. Along with that, are you willing to make 10% of what you're making today? Because that's what's going to, as the Russians are about to find out, that is what's going to happen to your economy if you are not connected in terms of that. This rise in isolationism, which they're going to refer to as America First, is going to bloom in the 1920s, and it is going to focus on outsiders and people who are uppity and people who are critics and un-American. It's the first time you see that description used, right? Un-American means you're violating the Constitution. That has nothing to do with any of this stuff, right? Un-American in this case is obviously casual and disloyal utterances. So literally, if you said President Wilson's a jerk, right? He's a loser or something like that, you could be held in account. Sedition, critical of the government or the army. Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence would be ripped up and tossed in jail as a result of this. The Klan revives, anti-Semitism, communism scare, and we'll see this again in the real Cold War. The place that actually has communists in Europe doesn't have a Red Scare. We don't have communists and we have a Red Scare. What does that say? It says, in essence, they're afraid of something that doesn't exist. They're afraid of this concept. Oh my God, it's right around the corner. Maybe you are. Maybe someone else is. Maybe the professor is. Right? Those kinds of things are easier psychologically because you don't have to think. You don't have to, you just react. I don't like those kinds of things. So the 1910s and 20s, following World War I, are going to set the term for American isolationism. And as we're going to see in the 20s, once the Great Depression hits, we don't have a reason kind of established in terms of our foreign policy to be involved in the next war either. And so we're not going to be active in that one as well. Right? I recognize that I just did 30 years of complex U.S. foreign policy, but I squished it down. The reason I did that is because by the time you get to the 1920s, we're back to normalcy kind of thing, the American public is not thinking about the war. Our foreign policy is no more a part of the everyday American life as it's going to be following World War II. Right? So you guys in this room, and even I when I was born, understood that the United States is a global superpower. It's part of who we are. It's how we have to think about ourselves. Right? That is not the case as a result of World War I. It's going to change Europe, but it's not going to change the United States. Okay, questions about that before we turn to the last one. The textbook does a really good job of talking about both World War I and the origins of World War II. If you've noticed, when I post these things, what do we got? 89 slides here. So this World War II is going to go on for quite some time. And there's a reason for that, which I'll get to. I will probably come back to this notion of what is fascism and how it links to racial identity, right? Make no mistake, Hitler has very little regard for the United States. Hitler looks at the United States as a mongrel, miscegenated kind of backwater to his demise. And obviously the Americans are going to view Hitler in a certain way, which we'll kind of get back to in a big way. But World War II is a turning point. And I always have this debate with other historians. History 1301 ends at the Civil War. History 1302 starts in the Civil War, starts after the Civil War. And we have this debate in terms of what is the most consequential military engagement in American history. I am completely convinced I'm correct in saying it's World War II. You could make a convincing argument that it's the Civil War, in large part because of the way the Civil War, as we talked about, shifts the federal government's relationship to the public. But what you're going to see here is a turning point in global history in which the United States is suddenly much more influential. First of all by accident, second of all by choice. And by the time we get to 1946, the U.S. is clearly designed. Again, hopefully you didn't waste an hour, not waste an hour of your life. I watch the State of the Union because I'm always find politics interesting, but it's not the best kind of speechifying, right? But if you watched it, I was like, the whole start of it was talking about World War II. The whole start of that speech was talking about what we as a country, how we define ourselves. And it's as a result of this. What you see at the bottom down here is a quote from Winston Churchill. Churchill is a conservative, he's a member of parliament, he's a lord, right? And he is out of power in 1936. And what he's looking at is seeing the rise of fascism in particular. An authoritarian state, a state that laughs at courts, a state that laughs at elections, a state that in essence uses propaganda to make their people believe whatever the hell they want to believe. Don't look at me, look at the Soviet Union, sorry. So look at Russia today, right, in terms of what's going on there. What Churchill is saying here is that you can avoid this all you want. You can turn your head and go, oh, well, it's just the January 6th uprising. It's just the use of propaganda. It's just this. There are consequences. And you can talk it away, you can laugh it away, you can meme it away, but at a certain point in time, and historically it's World War II, all the bills come due. Right? And what Churchill is going to say here is this year of procrastination is going to disappear. Right? We are now living in the consequences of that kind of willingness to be able to just, oh, well, it's just Herr Hitler, and it's just this, and it's just that. Oh, it's just the Jews being rounded up. Oh, it's just hate speech. Right? That there are consequences to this. It changes the way in which people talk about it. And what historians and Americans generally consider about World War II is they refer to it as the good war. And I will tell you right now, one of the essay questions, part one of one of the essay questions on World War I is why? That's the question, right? And I come back to the last exam you just got back. And I have a question that says, what's progressivism? Define it. Don't tell me it's progress, right? That is not defining it. That is just getting yourself off the hook. Well, progressive is progress. Why the hell are you going to call a war? Now, these are the casualty numbers, right? At the bottom of the list, what you got are 57,125,262 human beings died violently as a result of this war, right? Like you and me, like people right now in Ukraine, right, are going to be fine one week and dead the next, and probably dead as a result of trauma, as a result of being shot, as being, building falling on them. Russia, for example, loses 21.3 million people. Half of those are civilians, non-combatants, who are not carrying a rifle. China loses 11 million, Germany 7 million, Poland 7 million, Japan 2 million, Yugoslavia 2 million. Right? Where's the United States? About 500,000. Right? So again, when we talk about the imprint that this has on people, it's going to be different and in different regards. How the hell can historians call this a good war? Right? It's like Dr. Strangelove, if you ever seen the movie, right? I can guarantee you 20 to 30 million tops, right? And he gets this kind of proud look on his face. Only 60 million people die in this war, we're calling it a good war. How is that possible? The arguments that a historian would make, or that you might make on an essay question, is that this war is for a purpose. This war is to learn from the past mistakes and to change the way in which the United States defends democracy. Again, you couldn't ask for a better contemporary event. What you're going to see in the start of World War I are liberal democracies too afraid to stand up against autocracies. Right? That ain't the case this time. I think that's what Putin thought was going to happen. Everybody, no, you do it, you do it, you do it. But there is a sense of you cannot step away from this assumption. More long-lasting change in a 4-year period of time in the United States than in any period since the Civil War, and certainly any period since then. Right? So 9/11 offers an opportunity for that, but 9/11 just kind of fades pretty quickly, and it gets misdirected in ways we'll talk about. It validates basically these principles of liberalism. Again, don't go Glenn Beck on me. Liberalism, you could be a staunch conservative Republican. The Second Amendment is a liberal value. The Second Amendment is a constitutional protection of your right to own firearms. Right? That's liberalism. Right? So don't play the third grade game, seeing that word every time and immediately going, oh, it's a critical race theory, right? And all that kind of stuff. The domestic front is going to see the biggest change. Here's where you start seeing a concern at the national level for women and people of color and immigrants, right? I corrected gently on your exams. Well, it's about women and people of color. No, it's not. Progressivism could care less. They were as racist as everyone else at that point in time. World War II is going to force that mirror up to the United States and say, you look a lot like Adolf Hitler, right? I'm just saying, your treatment of race is a lot like the final solution. It sure appears to us. You're seeing these kinds of similarities. It asks this question, what do we stand for? And to the credit of the United States, I would argue, again, good war, is that we look and say these values are more than just bumper stickers. These values are more than just, I'm a tough guy, I'll do this is what I stand for, right? They really are what the United States is willing to sacrifice for. As a result, it is a war of ideology. And it is a war of ideology which comes down to what values do we hold? When I talk about liberal democracy, the values that we generally hold, if you want to boil them down to their bare essence, is that our governments are controlled by voters and hemmed in by constitutions, right? There's things that are protecting, and that our economy is quote-unquote free market. It is a capitalist economy, giving people choice, giving people agency, giving people an ability. And we look around very similar and say, is other people that are going to do this, they're going to be like us ideologically, they're going to be our allies. And what we want to do is to see more of those people than less, right? So it is going to, in essence, have a result that is going to have a long-term consequence. I'm out of time. Questions for Issue 1302. So I know it's a big topic, and we're going to spend some time on it. Needless to say, what were the causes, and that's going to be mostly on Friday. What were the respective roles of Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States? Those are